Briefing on the Iran nuclear deal. Can it survive without the US? My name is Richard Whitman. I'm Associate Fellow of the Europe Program here at Chatham House. And my colleague Sanam Vakil from the Middle East and North Africa Program will also be joining us on this webinar. As you'll be well aware, President Trump has stirred things up on Iran with his tweet yesterday. And what we're going to look at in this webinar is his decision to withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, analyze how Europe could develop a response to the reinstatement of sanctions, and what are the implications this might be for Iran and for the wider region. Can the agreement survive without the participation of the US, or is it likely that Iran will move away from compliance with the agreement? Does this European decision to seek to maintain the agreement put it on a collision course with the current US administration? Can the E3, France, Germany, and the UK, work with Russia and China to offset the benefits that have been lost to Iran by the US withdrawal? And to what extent will it be possible to shelter European banks and companies trading with Iran from secondary US sanctions? We'll try and address all of these issues during the webinar, but obviously we're very interested in hearing from all of you who have dialed in to join us, and we will come to you after we've had some introductory remarks. So, Sanam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you for joining us today. Just to kick off, I thought that I would give a little background and updater as to where we are, and also outline Iran's strategy going forward with regards to the JCPOA. You might have seen President Trump's tweet yesterday promising that Iran would experience the biggest of all wars should threats continue. This should be contextualized in a pattern of long-standing tensions between Washington and Tehran that have ebbed and flowed over 40 years with limited diplomatic ties or no diplomatic ties and limited diplomatic contact. And ultimately, both sides are playing for time and putting pressure on each other in order to obtain their objectives. From the American perspective, which I'm not going to delve into, but perhaps can talk about it in the Q&A. And there are a variety of schools of thought here on what Washington is ultimately trying to do, but the objective is that to weaken the Islamic Republic and bring them back to the negotiating table to negotiate a better deal with Iran, one that includes and addresses Iran's role in the region of the Middle East, one that also addresses Iran's ballistic missiles program and extends the life of the Iran nuclear agreement beyond what was originally agreed in 2015, so that it is a deal in perpetuity. President Trump is united in concert with Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, and this Gang of Four seem to have implemented a pressure strategy to push back Iran on its economic front, but also to try to destabilize the regime as well internally. And in order to do so, President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement on May 8th and has promised to impose new and more stringent sanctions against the Islamic Republic. The first round of sanctions are snapping back on August 6th. The key sectors that are affected are banking, mining, automotive, and aviation. On November 4th, the end of the 180-day wind-down period, sanctions will resume on the shipping, oil and gas, banking, insurance, and energy sectors. The U.S. administration has indicated that unlike previous rounds of sanctions against Iran, these sanctions are directed to reducing Iran's oil exports to zero, although there has been a bit of walking back from that position in the past few weeks as well. And the U.S. administration has been traveling to relevant capitals and meeting with potential potential leaders that could help Iran. And so we've seen the US administration go to India, met with President Putin. President Trump's administration has also visited Erdogan in Turkey and also tried to pressure the Turkish government, all to suggest that this administration is seeking a very strong position vis-a-vis Iran. And in the context of the recent aggressive rhetoric that came both from Tehran and from Washington, I think that we can anticipate that things could potentially heat up, not necessarily escalate militarily, although the risk of that, of course, is something that we cannot rule out. From the Iranian position, we've seen in the strategy evolve since President Trump's withdrawal on May 8th. Their goal is to try to keep the JCPOA alive beyond symbolic support from Europe. And what President Rouhani has been trying to do is to pressure the P4, the remaining signatories of the deal, as well as the E3, Germany, France, and the UK, as well as the EU as a whole, to maintain their commitment to the deal. As of right now, President Rouhani was recently in Europe, visiting Switzerland and Austria, and he used those engagements as an opportunity to reaffirm Iran's commitment to the JCPOA and to continue to pressure for a better deal from Europe. So it remains to be seen if Europe can actually help Iran in a meaningful way. But Iran's strategy, which I'll explain right now, is built out of on a number of different levels. The first is to maintain divisions between Washington and Europe. This is, of course, to prevent a resumption of sanctions that were seen under 2012 or 2011 going forward, where there was international unity against Iran's nuclear program. So Iran, in order to maintain that position, is going to try to demonstrate accountability, be the reliable actor, and for the time being, remain committed to the JCPOA. We should expect that position to continue until the end of this year. And depending on the European package of support for Iran, there might be a revisiting of that position. But for the time being, Iran will remain committed to the deal in order to maintain European support. Another strategy for Iran is, of course, to use threatening language and to use the combination of threats, not just against the United States, but also we heard a few weeks ago threats to close the Straits of Hormuz, which indeed rattled oil markets as well. This is, of course, not a new threat for Iran. They've been threatening at various times to close the Straits of Hormuz, but this has never yet materialized. And I believe that threat is just a symbolic one to demonstrate that they have the potential to rattle the markets. They can obtain some leverage, but ultimately doing so would be very counterproductive, because obviously all of Iran's oil is shipped through those straits, and all movement of goods, most movement of goods comes through the straits as well. So they'd be shooting themselves in the foot. Nevertheless, we should expect this threatening language to continue. Iran is really effectively backed into a corner right now, and so the threats demonstrate that it might eventually have the potential to react should the political leadership choose to do so. And any sort of reaction that we might expect from Iran wouldn't necessarily take place in the Straits of Hormuz or in an overt military way. Iran has multiple means to react, and its relationships with proxy and militia groups throughout various Middle Eastern countries, from Syria to Lebanon to Iraq and Yemen, give it greater access and potential to disrupt and cause unrest beyond its borders. We could also, of course, see a somewhat resumption of launching of ballistic missiles And there is the cyberspace sphere where Iran has in the past been disruptive, and we could expect some sort of activity in that realm as well. But the threats are also important, and I should say something really briefly about domestic politics as well. All of this pressure on Iran has been quite destabilizing for President Rouhani, who has campaigned twice on protecting the JCPOA and lifting sanctions against the Iranian economy and integrating Iran into the international economic markets. The failure to protect the deal has been devastating for the president. The Iranian economy is definitely under significant pressure. The rial, the currency, has depreciated by 50% since January. We've seen waves of protests, not just politically motivated protests, but particularly directed to economic and environmental issues as well. Corruption and economic mismanagement has become a sort of hot political issue around the country. So the regime is also under pressure, and this threatening language for President Rouhani shows to his hardline opponents within the political establishment that he too can be strong, he too can stand up to the United States, and it creates an edifice of unity at a time where the regime is really under threat. And finally, Iran has been working very hard to develop internal mechanisms to protect itself from the forthcoming sanctions. There have been significant discussions in parliament, strategies that have been passed, and it's really very much looking to develop its bilateral relationships and rely on its bilateral relationships to protect itself from this new wave of sanctions. It knows that there's not going to be one country that's going to come out and save Iran, but it's through this sort of diversified portfolio where it can perhaps lean a little on Turkey or China or Russia or India, that it might be able to sell less oil, but nevertheless still be able to rely on its oil exports to a certain degree. I will stop there. There's so much more to talk about, but I think that I'm going to pass the baton on to Richard, and maybe we can answer some other questions and talk about other things during the Q&A.
That's great, Sanam. Thank you. And just to encourage everybody who's listening in to pop messages and questions into us so we can pick those up in a moment. Perhaps if I could, just to add to your comments, Sanam, from a sort of perspective of Europe, it's obviously this is happening in a context in which is already a difficult moment for transatlantic relations anyway, with disputes, trade disputes between Europe and the US bubbling over, and also broader questions about the US security commitment to Europe following Mr. Trump's recent visit for the NATO summit and then his meeting with Mr. Putin. So this is another dimension to what is already a relationship which has become more problematic under his presidency. And I guess a key question is whether it's actually possible to finesse the disagreement between the US and Europeans on the JCPOA. I think from the European perspective, it's an issue about sort of rules-based international order. They feel as if they've invested a lot in the agreement with Iran. They see it as one of their sort of showcase collective foreign policy undertakings. And also a view, which I think has been pretty starkly expressed, that this is an internationally endorsed process, and therefore it undermines more than just the relationship with Iran, but also potentially undermines mechanisms for addressing international security problems. But it also raises some interesting questions, I think, for example, as to what the future relationship between the EU, the E3, and Russia and China will be if they're all working together to maintain the agreement as much as they can, because that will be an interesting set of relationships to follow, and particularly if they're interested in been working very closely together to provide some kind of workaround on US sanctions. What Europeans clearly face is not just maintaining their relationship with the US on the Iran question, but also how they manage the relationship with Iran. If we take the relationship with the US first, clearly there is a big European concern about the secondary sanctions issue and whether they can address the secondary sanctions issue. And so far, there's been very little European traction in Washington to sort of address or to mitigate impact on European companies. At the same time, you've obviously got a context in the US, which is one in which there's a bit of a wait and see, I think, on the part of Congress and other interested parties as to how Trump's policy on Iran plays itself out. In terms of the relationship with Iran, for the Europeans are obviously the most important, are far more important traders with Iran than the US has been. They've really taken more advantage of the removal of sanctions in terms of investment, in terms of trading activity with Iran. So they have more to lose economically, but also I think they're interested in widening the platform to have a broader critical dialogue with Iran outside the nuclear question. And we've seen the developments in interesting formats such as the so-called E4 format that's bringing Italy into the E3 configuration with France, Germany, and the UK to have political discussions with Iran, and a couple of rounds of those in February and May. But I think from my perspective, one of the interesting questions is the degree to which a collective European position will actually hold over the coming months. The European Commission has put in place the mitigating measure or legal measures through the blocking statute, which is intended to address the question of the extraterritoriality of US sanctions and the way that they will affect European companies. And that's now sort of working its way through the legal processes in Brussels. But there are clearly very differential levels of trade between European countries and Iran, differential levels of investment with France and Italy particularly involved in significant investment, but obviously major UK companies such as BP, BA and Quercus also potentially in the wrong end of sanctions. So there's quite a lot at stake of those who've been early investors and those who've sort of made the move to Iran in terms of investment opportunities. It'll be interesting to see what the corporate response will be. And at the moment, it seems to be a high degree of caution and essentially winding or unwinding the positions that currently exist. But let's go to some of the questions that have been raised, and we've had a number of people who have called in, dialed in, and the first question I'd like to take is from Jane Kinemont, and her question is: there have been reports that some countries are looking at options for their central banks to finance business deals with Iran, and in an attempt to avoid US sanctions. How advanced are these ideas, and do you think they're plausible? Do you want to say anything on that, Sanam?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Indeed, this is part of what's being discussed by the E3, and some of the other countries in Europe that are looking at this are Switzerland, Austria, and beyond, even Italy as well. So this is something that is being discussed, but it's very hard to know if this is a deliverable option, really, because the calculation here is very much tied to the American position and how much pressure the US government is going to bring down upon each country and also individuals. I mean, they've also indicated that while they are not going to be granting any waivers for any businesses that intend to continue to do business with Iran, or resulting in a lot of withdrawal of the big companies, the big multinational companies. They have also suggested that they might also target individuals going forward. So this is, I can't give any more detail beyond being speculative. I think it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. And something that we are seeing is a bit of an attempt at negotiation. And I think that the Trump administration might be overwhelmed by individual bilateral negotiations that will take place in order to protect some part of each country's business with Iran.
Thank you, Sanam. I mean, I think it's also worth noting that there are some of the difficulties of preserving banking facilities and also lending were demonstrated very well when the European Commission proposed that the EU's investment bank, the European Investment Bank, expanded its lending remit to cover Iran as part of a sort of mitigating, as part of a package of mitigating measures for Iran, and that was slapped down very, very quickly by the EIB president, Werner Hoyer, who made very clear that it's basically risky and unwise because of the fact that they're plugged into the US banking themselves and how hold debt denominated in dollars. So that there are clearly anxieties around the financial and banking services sector in terms of whether this is actually doable. And the ideas that have been mooted have obviously been for central banks to step in and provide facilities. But I think they do face some formidable obstacles. Not least, there needs to be a strong political consensus, I think, that you would hold to that view. If we could move on, and there's another question that's come in from Ra Mason, which is, to what extent do you think that Iran will attempt to target the USA's key Asia-Pacific partners, such as Japan, in order to isolate the position of the Trump administration beyond the division only between Europe and the United States? Do you want to say anything on that, Sanam?
Happy to say a few words, but again, very speculative. I think the Iranian government is not as focused on Japan, really, because going on past actions and relationships, Japan has not traditionally been willing to stand up to US pressure, particularly with regards to Iran. So from my understanding, it is not part of the portfolio, diversification portfolio that the Iranian government is looking at right now. Europe is its main focus, really, because this is an opportunity to make sure that this is not a repeat of 2012, as I've already said, and because psychologically and symbolically preserving trade with Europe is very important to the Rouhani administration. And it's part of his vision of a more open, integrated Iran.
Okay, great, thank you. We got two questions here which overlap, so I'm going to take them together. One from Haldun Solmaturk, which is, should the deal survive without the US? And then Donald Frazier, who asks almost the same question but expands on it. Why should the deal survive? The focus on the rules-based process obscures the terrible deal that is the heart of the deal. Europe seems far more eager for short-term stability than for longer-run nuclear security. A deal with the devil? Question mark. Sanam.
Good questions. The deal should survive, in my opinion, for a few reasons. And I'm going to give it to you from the perspective of dealing with Iran, ultimately. Yes, it's not a perfect deal, and I think that if you talk to anyone who was involved in the negotiations, this was a negotiation that resulted in compromise on all sides. But I think that this is a big moment of consequence for Iran. And the deal was an opportunity not to change Iran overnight, but to change Iran incrementally, by building trust, by building confidence, by building exchanges, and bringing Iran out of the mentality of isolation. Of course, there are many things that have gone wrong, including a lack of additional pressure or investment or building upon the JCPOA to then get a JCPOA 2 that would deal with Iran's regional involvement, or an attempt to bridge regional tensions as well. So there have been many failures of this process. But the reason why it's ultimately important to protect this deal is US-Iranian enmity has been a destabilizing force in the Middle East for 4 decades. The Islamic Republic will celebrate its 40th anniversary next February. And this is an important moment for Iran, really, because we are on the precipice of change of leadership. We don't know when it's going to happen, but Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, is 79 years old this month. And whether he's ill or not ill, the clock is ticking for him. And it's when power is going to change at the top that perhaps his enmity, and he's very much tied to this ideological anti-American position, could pass with him. And the Iranian population has very much changed. It's a very different Iran. It's an Iran that wants integration. But under the pressure of what is taking place now, with much popular frustration, my biggest concern is that the breaking of the JCPOA will not empower moderate voices and will not lead to and nurture incremental change in Iran, but rather embolden Iranian hardliners and give them another opportunity, both at the ballot box in the forthcoming 2020 parliamentary elections and 2021 presidential elections, but give them a chance to also have a place again at the top in the supreme leadership position. And that's going to institutionalize more tension in Iran, but also in the wider region. And I think that is ultimately destabilizing for Europe and ultimately for the United States. It is very much disengaging from the Middle East. I'll leave it there.
I mean, it's probably also worth noting that, of course, that in the 11 rounds of inspections by the IAEA, there's been no suggestion that Iran has been involved in any breach of its obligations. So it is still compliant in terms of the narrow terms of the deal itself. Let's move on to another question from Ramin Garavi, which is to what degree will the EU blocking regulation be effective at encouraging investment, knowing that investors will be forced to bear a heavy compliance burden? Well, I think from my perspective, I think it's not so much expanding investment as holding the line for investment, which is already there. And I think what we're already seeing is sort of defensive behavior on the part of organizations which have invested. I don't know what you think, Sanam.
I'm in agreement with you, Richard. I think also the blocking regulation, I think at this point is very much a symbolic tool. I don't think that the EU can ultimately compel or ultimately be able to protect individuals going forward. We have never seen it really implemented in a meaningful way. So I think the massive withdrawal of of international companies from Iran is really reflective of the fact that there is limited confidence in the EU's ability to stand up to the US on this.
I would agree with you. I think it's much about sort of Europeans saying to themselves, that we want to hold the line, as it is about a sort of meaningful response to what the impacts might be on European companies. We're going to take one more question, and that's from Iraj Bagaharati. How far are Iran and the Iranian nuclear issue an indicator or catalyst of a growing schism between the US and Europe? Is there a growing view that Europe and the US have long-term conflicting interests? And is this something that is working to the benefit of Iran? I know you touched on this in your introductory remarks, Sanam. Is there anything further you want to say on it?
Well, I hope you'll weigh in as well, but I think ultimately this is a schism, uh, but it's not a new schism. I mean, we've seen these sort of conflicting tensions between Europe and the United States, particularly over Iran and how they addressed Iran during the outbreak of the nuclear tensions in 2002. And it took the E3 in particular a very long time to join the US's position vis-a-vis Iran. And the E3 during that period led negotiations and tried to broker a number of deals with Iran over its nuclear program. I think this is a reflection of deep frustration on both sides, particularly obviously in the context of President Trump's new negotiation and pressure tactics, which is affecting all countries around the world. But I do think it's also this sort of moment for Europe to reflect on its role and its ability to manage and mitigate a conflict that probably has a greater impact for them than it does for the United States. And Iran is very good at exploiting that and will continue to exploit that. We've heard President Rouhani, for example, threaten and say, oh, if Europe is worried about the influx of refugees, well, all it's going to take is limited Iranian cooperation in the region to open the door for another round of massive refugee flow into Europe, or the drug trade, indicating that Iran is a reliable actor and helps Europe as well. So I think this is an important issue, and there are different, ultimately different strategies between Europe and the United States and how to deal with Iran, with Europe and European leaders truly believing that the carrot and stick policy and engagement is ultimately the best way to pressure and nurture a relationship with Iran.
Thanks, Anam. I mean, I just to add to what you said, I think the other schism issue is the schism between Europeans, because of course they have very differential interests here, and I think there's an interest. We managed to get through all of this time without talking Brexit, thank goodness. But there is obviously the Brexit issue in the sense that the UK will be moving outside the EU. There's no indication that it will see a differential policy on the part of the UK, but it's a useful reminder of the fact that there are differential interests between Europeans, and you tend to see them at their most acute when you're talking about the relationship with the United States. And therefore, a sort of evolving US position on Iran could open up differences between European governments as to what's the best way forward. Well, thank you to everybody for your questions. Let me also, on your behalf, thank Sanam for joining us. And just a reminder, as you'll see on your screen, that Chatham House events are coming up in September, because there'll be a pause for the European summer. And you can see that there are events coming up on the UK-Saudi Arabia relationships, cybersecurity, and the global trade landscape series. All exciting events to come. So thank you very much for all of you joining us. Just a reminder that all of this was not under the Chatham House rules, so people are free to use all the material that we've had under this discussion here this morning. So thank you very much for listening in.
Thank you. Bye-bye.